So take your Bible and go to Romans chapter 13. Romans chapter 13, familiar text, and certainly always referred to or quoted with regards to the role of our response to government, and certainly any teaching on government from a biblical worldview. You come to Romans 13. So I want to read it. Romans 13, beginning at verse 1, Paul says, every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. There is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause for fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you'll have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing, for it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due them, tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, and honor to whom honor. Let's pray together. Lord, as we've opened the text this morning, we pray that you would open our hearts and our minds to the work of the Spirit among us. Father, for clarity not only of understanding, but Lord, over our study of this, that you'd give us clarity in some of the complexities of how this plays out in our life. And so, Lord, I pray that you would do your work in us, reminding us that we serve a King who is a living, exalted King, who is the Christ, the one that you have appointed. Lord, and it is in his name that we ask this. Amen. We come to Romans 13, I think, at an interesting time, certainly a time in history that certainly, for us, it ought to capture our attention, to be quite frank. We live in times and events that what Romans 13 says ought to make a difference in terms of how we think and how we act. I mean, step back for a moment and realize that a significant historical event is going to unfold in the capital of this country over the course of the next few weeks. A trial in the Senate to determine whether or not to remove the president of this country. That's a significant historical event. And you say, where does the scripture come to bear on that? Does it? Is it just for one nation to assassinate another leader from another nation? Like what transpired recently. Is it just? Is it right? Now, I'm asking these questions not to say, well, which side of the political spectrum am I on? That's not the purpose. These are legitimate, complex questions that you and I have to wrestle with. Biblically, we ought to. There's an election this year. I don't know about you. I'm not looking forward to it. But that's okay. I don't get to vote. Certainly, I think we're aware that we live in extremely partisan times, where there's that political divide. And it's not just out there, it impacts the church. So how does it impact the church? Well, the end of last year, the editor of Christianity Today, Mark Galli, before he retired, wrote an editorial laying out a case for the removal of the president. Christianity Today, a leading evangelical, maybe not as influential as it was at one point in time, but still, you have a segment of evangelical Christendom that's saying, listen, Christians, don't be naive. Evangelicals, don't be naive. Don't be complacent. Don't condone immoral behavior. You ought to be, he didn't say leading the charge, but you certainly ought to be laying out the case for the removal of an immoral president. So in response to that, a leading evangelical theologian, Wayne Grudem, responds and said, here's the reasons why we shouldn't remove the president. Wayne Grudem is a theologian that certainly we respect. We use his systematic theology here at church and in other places for teaching. And so that doesn't mean we agree with everything that Grudem says, but he certainly is a well-respected theologian. He's written a major work on the role of politics, government. He's wrestled through the role of government and our response to it politically. And he says no. So now you've got within the evangelical church a divide. So that partisanship and that divide politically now has crept into the life of the evangelical church. And you say, this has got to be the worst it's ever been in partisanship. And I certainly, oftentimes we think that the times we live are always the worst. And so I was talking to my son Jonathan, and the disclaimer is Jonathan does work in Washington, D.C. He's on staff for a congressman. So there's the disclaimer. He said, Dad, yeah, things are bad. He said, but I've been listening to podcasts on the elections, presidential elections throughout history, looking at all the historical presidential elections. He says, you know what? He said, it's no different than what it used to be. He said, if you go back and see what was written about each other, what people said, what they did, he said, it's just like today. But here's the difference. He said, the difference is the communication. And by that, he means the dissemination of information. And so with technology and the explosion of knowledge, how we get our information, the communication of that information, certainly it seems like, wow, it has filtered out in a much larger context nationally. He said, that has made the difference, but understand that the issue, partisanship as we would call it, has always been the case. And it's never been pleasant. So, we come to Romans 13. Does this mean we shouldn't care? No. It means we have a responsibility to understand correctly. I told you a number of weeks ago that a lot of times the things we're coming across in Romans 12 and Romans 13, it's not that you need to have them interpreted for you. We don't need to have this interpreted. I think everyone understands what it says, right? I mean, the things we're going to see are really clear. The complexity is, how do you apply this? And how do you apply these things? Some are very simple, but some, it's like pulling on different threads and the ramifications of it, particularly this one. And so the way I want to handle this is, I want to look at the clear this morning. Let's understand the clear. And next week we'll come back and try to pull some of those threads and look at some of the details, some of the complexities. And one of the ways I'll do that, at least try to, is this. It may raise this morning, and certainly as you think about this, may raise questions. And so I want you to, if you have a question, then you email me by Thursday morning. You email me the question by Thursday morning. I'm not promising that we'll answer every question. But we'll try to deal with some of the complexities of how this plays out in our particular situation. Understand there are some particulars with regards to time, space, and where we are in history, that then how does this come to bear on that? Because Paul was writing at a time where he would not have envisioned. Understand, Paul would never have envisioned this time politically. Okay? And we'll talk about what some of those threads are. Understand, Paul, I can't give you Paul's birth date to celebrate, but Paul probably was born in the time of Caesar Augustus. Same time Jesus was, somewhere in that time frame. When Paul writes this, Nero's on the throne. Nero is emperor. Paul has lived his entire life in an imperial kingdom. How many of you have lived in an imperial kingdom? None of us have. I'm going to tell you, living in an imperial kingdom is a lot different than living whether you get to vote this year for who your president is. So at least let's look at the clear. As you look at the 7 verses, remember, Paul didn't write in chapters, and so there is a flow of thought, and we'll pick up one of those ideas in a moment. At least this is clear. There are 2 responsibilities here. What Paul gives us are 2 responsibilities. There's the responsibility of the church, the responsibility of believers to governing authorities. So that is clear. Paul gives us some instructions, clear instructions, with regards to our responsibility to governing authorities. The second is the responsibility of the governing authority. Okay? The responsibility of the governing authority, both to its citizens, and I think ultimately it will be to God. And that leads us to this. Look, let's look at the responsibility of government first. The first thing that is really clear that Paul tells us is that the governing authority is a delegated authority. It's a delegated authority. Paul says, look, there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Whether or not they acknowledge it is immaterial. Years ago, heard R.C. Sproul talking about the little ditty that we all are familiar with. He said, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. And R.C. Sproul says, let me correct that. God said it, that settles it. Whether or not you believe it is immaterial. Okay? The reality is, the authority is God, not you, whether you believe it or not. And so Paul says, look, whether or not the governing authority recognizes that it is delegated, that authority by God is totally immaterial. It's a fact, it's a reality. He doesn't say only the righteous government. Sometimes that's the way we might practically think. Righteous government comes from God, wicked government comes, they're ordained by Satan, right? No. Paul doesn't make that distinction. Every existing authority, he says, is delegated with that authority by God. If there is a delegation of authority, that means the highest authority, the ultimate authority, is not the government. The ultimate authority, the higher authority, is the one who delegates it to somebody else, and that is, in this case, God. Every authority exists, is established by the higher authority, God. Now, maybe Paul had in mind Daniel. I won't have you turn there in Daniel chapter 2, but in Daniel, when he is confronting King Nebuchadnezzar, who is an emperor, at this point in time, probably the most powerful force, at least in the then-known world, Daniel is called in to interpret a dream. He's living in Babylon. Just a little bit, again, understand the background. Nebuchadnezzar is the king who's responsible for the destruction of his home. Nebuchadnezzar is the king who's responsible for the annihilation, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. When those things happen, this probably meant that he was the king responsible maybe for the death of his parents or his relatives. You see, Daniel may have been of a noble class. And typically, when those peoples were being conquered, Daniel may have been spared as a young man, carried off as a captive. The likelihood is maybe his parents and his relatives would have been killed. So Daniel is now in the presence of the man responsible for the destruction of his homeland, of his home city, the annihilation of that, and probably the death of his relatives. I don't think you would argue that Nebuchadnezzar was a moral king. And he stands before Nebuchadnezzar, and as he begins to have to interpret the dream, what he begins with is reminds the king that there is one who is the ultimate king, the God of heaven, and the God of heaven sets up kings and takes them down. Nebuchadnezzar, you are not here by your own authority or your own power or your own ability. You are here because the only true and wise God has made you king for this time. And you, therefore, have been delegated authority. And God has every right to give it, and God has every right to take it away. Paul is recognizing that same thing for Nero. Secondly, then, out of that, if it's delegated, they give an account. If God appoints and delegates to them authority, then God, the ultimate judge, will hold them accountable. again, whether or not they acknowledge God, whether or not they want to acknowledge that He's the one who's given them that role, is immaterial. If God is the one who delegates, God is the one who holds them accountable. And if He holds them accountable, then how, therefore, they are to rule matters. And that means they're not to be tyrannical. So if you look here in Romans 13, he says, rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Tyranny is where you don't know the difference between good and evil, where the government acts in such a way that the people live in fear to know whether what they do, whether it's the law, whether it's right, whether it's good, or whether there's cause for the wrath of God or the wrath of the government. They don't know. If I act in this way that I think is lawful, but the government, the authority says, oh no, we get to choose what's lawful, what's not lawful, and we will punish you for even doing good because we are the ones who determine who gets judged, and you have no way of knowing what the basis of that is. It may lead to anarchy, but tyranny. See, you have no cause, you shouldn't be producing a people, you shouldn't be ruling over a people where they're afraid because they don't know how they're to act. They don't know what's good, what's evil. Remember, there is an indictment upon those who call evil good and good evil. There's confusion, but it's confusing to the people, and therefore they live in fear. How do you know whether you live under a tyranny or live in freedom? Nathan Sharansky, who was a Soviet dissident, he served 9 years in the Gulag. And he was the first one who was released in Glasnost by Gorbachev. Now, last week, I realized I had to spend some time explaining what a 45 was. Okay? And it dawned on me this week, okay, that there are people sitting in this room right now who were not alive at 9/11. You said 9/11 wasn't that long ago, was it? If we took a poll, you'd be surprised. There are people in this room right now who were not born September 11th, 2001. And as I thought about that and said, whoa, that son who's in Washington was born in 1989. He grew up in a world without a Soviet Union. So when I talk about Nathan Sharansky being in a Soviet gulag, the first one released by Gorbachev, for some people here, I might as well be talking about Civil War, or I might as well be talking about Julius Caesar, because it seems like that was so long ago. It wasn't. 1989. Mark Beadle asked us the other night at the elders meeting, he said, hey, for many of you, does 1990 seem like it was that far back? And it's like, he goes, it's the same distance between now and 1990 as now and 2050. Like, whoa, that seems like so far away. But I say that so that you know that Nathan Sharansky released at Glasnost the reforms that were beginning to happen in the Soviet Union. He was released. He actually then went on to Israel and became a member of the Knesset. He's written on the subject of democracy and freedom, and the ultimate test that he gives, he says, you know you live in freedom when you are able to walk into a public square and able to speak out against your ruler, your governing authority. When you are able to do that, now you live in freedom. In other words, when you can march through the streets of Tehran without fear of reprisal for speaking out against injustice in your land, like last night, that's the difference between tyranny and freedom. Paul says, one of the responsibilities of the government is to make sure that people live not under tyranny. They know what is good, what is evil. Fourthly, it is a minister of God. That's what he calls it. Verse 4, it is a minister of God. It is a deacon of God. In this way, Paul says it is the deacon or the servant of God in executing vengeance. So, they said Paul didn't write in chapters, and so the end of chapter 12, what we call chapter 12, he says, look, you shouldn't seek vengeance. Vengeance belongs to who? Vengeance belongs to God. See? Don't seek revenge. Vengeance belongs to God. That Paul is speaking of in personal life, because vengeance is assigned to the role of governing authority. That's what he says here. It is an instrument of God to execute vengeance, the vengeance or the wrath of God. So it is an instrument of vengeance. Sometimes our idea that God will take vengeance on those who are the afflicted and the oppressed in our life, and is that ultimately is just down the road. At the end of the game, God will judge them and take vengeance on them. What Paul is saying is some of that vengeance of God is in the now. It's in the intermediate. The role of the government is to execute its justice and to take vengeance on the evil. That's Genesis chapter 9. That's, by the way, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is not giving you the personal right to smack somebody back. It is the role of the government to exact justice in the right retribution, the right manner, to seek correction, to seek retribution, to seek justice. It's a minister of God for that purpose. Fifthly, it is good. It is for good. Notice that he says it is a minister of God to you for the good. Good must have a definition. You must be able to define what's good and what's evil. So, it can't be relative. For example, Brussels sprouts. How many of you like Brussels sprouts? Raise your hand. It's okay. Are you crazy? They're disgusting. And I don't care how you fix them, whether you roast them or what. Brussels sprouts are disgusting. They're not good. See, the definition of good is now what? Relative. According to my personal taste, personal choices, I can't define what the good of government is, it must come from a definition that is transcendent, a higher definition of good, and ultimately the definition of good is measured by God himself. God is good. All that God does is good. Therefore, how the government acts in righteousness is not merely just forensic declaration of righteousness. That's not merely all righteousness is. The righteousness of God also extends to how God acts. So when you look into the Old Testament, it's how does God deal with the afflicted? How are we to deal with the poor? How are we to deal with the orphan? How are we to deal with the widows? How are we to deal with the strangers? How are we to deal? How are you to act towards those? Those are reflections of righteousness and reflections of goodness. And so it is a minister of God for good to accomplish the goodness that defines what God says is good, even if they don't acknowledge him. That sometimes is described and defined as the common good, your well-being. Not merely what benefits them, what benefits them for their own gain, but what is the good for the whole. Lastly, I ought to expect that the government has a right to make laws for the good of the country. Now, quickly, I've got to deal with the responsibility for us. Hey, it's easy. Paul says, be in subjection to governing authorities. Hey, that's easy, right? Put yourself under the authority of the government. That's a consistent message. That's what Peter says. That's what Paul says in other places. Hey, that's simple, right? Obey the government. Because he says to resist them is the same thing as to resist God. Your attitude, how you respond to governing authorities, is a picture, ultimately, of your response to God. For when you resist them, you're resisting God because God's the one who put them in authority. You say, whoa. Hang on a minute. Am I to obey the government in everything? Aha. See, now we start moving. There's no problem understanding what it says. Now the complexity of application, isn't it? Is civil disobedience on the table as legitimate or not? You say, well, certainly, God told Peter, when Peter went to preach again, that he ought to be proclaiming the gospel. The government says you can't do that. And Peter said, who do I obey, you or God? So therefore, there's just cause for civil disobedience. Okay. Is that the only exception? Is there a place? At the end of the year, 2019, a Chinese pastor who had been imprisoned, he had been arrested and been imprisoned, was formally sentenced to 9 years in a labor camp. His name is Wang Yi. Wang Yi was the pastor of a large unregistered church and was accused of speaking out against the government. He was accused of practicing illegal business behavior, and therefore the government sentenced him to 9 years. Now, that is, we would say, is unjust, certainly immoral, and there is a means for us in this country to petition to see legally a way to try to address that even in a foreign land, and that's happening. But that wasn't the end of it. The Chinese government then also rewrote some of their laws or tightened up some of their laws. So now you have to be a registered church. And to summarize, you have to speak well of the government. You have to promote socialism in your church. You live in China, you're in the church. By the way, he wasn't the only one arrested. Some of the people of the church were arrested too. Do you obey that law or not? You can preach the gospel, but while you're preaching the gospel, you have to also speak about how good communism is. Here's where it really gets complex. And these are not sour grapes. Historians have wrestled for years over this issue. Was it just for the colonies and people within the colonies to declare independence and go to war against the British government? Well, one of the ways you try to argue that is tyranny, see? Opposing tyranny. Your name is John Witherspoon. You signed that Declaration of Independence. You're a minister. You're preaching in a church. And yet there are people in your congregation who don't feel the same way you do because of Romans 13. See, so personal scale, large scale. You want to pull on that thread for a little while. I think Paul does have a particular thing in mind when he writes this. I think there's something that's pulling on his string. I think what Paul is getting at is he does not want to give any just cause for the government authority to charge you or anybody else as a believer with sedition. Let me tell you why I think that. Claudius, the emperor before Nero, had signed an edict that evicted all Jews from Rome. That happened at the end of somewhere like 48 AD. Remember Aquila and Priscilla in the Bible? They had to leave Rome because of that edict. And so the question is, why did Claudius do that? The speculative answer is this: the Jews have always been a thorn in the side of anybody who's tried to rule them. They are difficult people. Stiff-necked, obstinate, stubborn people. That's how God described them and Moses described them. They've always been prickly to try to rule over. And finally, actually, the Romans got so fed up with them, that's why they destroyed them, the city in 70 AD. And so he looked in Rome, and he sees not only the potential for zealotry on the part of some of the Jews, there's another problem. That the Jews are now fighting amongst each other. It's like kind of a civil war that's happening in Rome. You know what it is? Suetonius, the historian, says that it was instigated because of a man named Chrestus. And people look at that, we're not sure, but the idea is that Chrestus may be the term Christ. That the Jews, as the message of the gospel comes into Rome, and there's talking about Christ, who Christ is, that is so antagonistic against other Jews that they start fighting amongst each other. And Claudius is afraid it's going to spill over. And so he says, look, out of Rome. Because he's fearful of seditious plots. Insurrection. And so what Paul, I think, here is trying to say, look, how we respond to governing authorities, do not give them cause to charge you with insurrection. They may slander you. They may accuse you. They accuse Jesus of sedition. The Jews couldn't crucify Jesus for blasphemy. That's why in the appeal to Pilate, it is, we have no king but Caesar, king of the Jews. See, he could put him to death under Roman law for insurrection, sedition. Paul says they may slander you, they may accuse you, but don't give them a just reason to do that. So you respond to them in a way that honors the name of Christ, that honors that sense of living at peace. Secondly, if you step outside the law, you ought to expect that the government will punish you. That's a responsibility. Third, subjecting to the law does not violate our conscience, he says. It doesn't bring guilt upon us that we carry around. Fourthly, he says the last part is respond to the government correctly. So the last part of verse 6, verse 7, he says, look, you honor them, you respect them, and you pay taxes. And maybe reminiscent, again, in Paul's mind, is that the words of Jesus that he somehow familiar with. Jesus in Matthew chapter 22, they attempt to trap Jesus, and they say, should we pay taxes? And he says, give me a coin. Whose picture's on the coin? He said, well, there's Caesar. And he says, okay, then pay to Caesar what is Caesar's, and pay to God what is God's. And it says they left absolutely confused by his wisdom. But Jesus is giving a principle. There's nothing wrong with taxes. Taxes have a purpose for government to do its job. Pay your taxes. Honor them. So, how do we respond to those in authority over us? Good or bad? Some of those threads now, and again, in particular, how do you deal with the question of immoral government? How do you deal with that here in this country? You see, you are governed by yourself. You're a government of the people. The law of this land says you have a part in the governing authority. That's one of the threads I want to pull next week. How do you go about dealing with immoral leaders? How do I deal with immoral issues? The issue of civil disobedience. How do I deal with it as a believer in an environment where I have the freedom to speak, to dissent over policies and issues? How do I do that? How do I do that at the same time not slandering individuals or personalities with whom I may disagree? See, that now moving from issue to people. How do I honor them for the office, for the role that they have, and yet offer dissent? How do I enter into discourse on the issues in a society that in many ways is unique. Understand, in 1776, there was no model for the founding fathers to look at and say, this is the way we do it. France was a monarchy. Spain was a monarchy. England was a monarchy. When the framers put this thing together, there's some ties back to the Romans and to the Greeks, but believe me, it's different. That's why it's called the Great Experiment. And the fact that it's lasted as long as it has, I want to tell you, is the providence of God. Does that mean that we are just as a nation, that we're a Christian? No. But how does this now play out in the complexities of choices and living, responding? That's what I want to do next week, is pull some of those threads to how we live now, taking the clear principles of Paul and apply them to this particular historical moment in time.